Thank you for joining Columbia Riverkeeper today as we talk to the authors and journalists whose decades of collaborative work expose the human toll of Hanford nuclear site operations. So my name is Simone Anter. I'm a staff attorney at Columbia Riverkeeper, and today I'm joined by Kate Brown, author of Plutopia, Nuclear Families, Atomic Cities, and the Great Soviet and American Plutonium Disasters, Tricia Pritikin, author of The Hanford Plaintiffs, Voices from the Fight for Atomic Justice, and investigative journalist Doran Steele, who broke the stories of cancers and other serious illnesses downwind and downriver of Hanford, and also the author of the foreword to The Hanford Plaintiffs. So thank you all for joining me today. I'm super excited to hear more from you and about your work. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tricia to do an introduction of her work and the connection of that work with Karen and Kate and kind of kick off our conversation.
Okay, thank you, Simone, for the excellent introduction. It's an honor for me to be here with Karen and Kate and you today. I'm going to start today with a story. It's a story about a downwinder, an investigative reporter, and a nuclear historian. The downwinder, born and raised in the path of radioactive fallout, secretly released from the Hanford Nuclear Weapons Facility in South Central Washington State, first learned about her exposure to radioactive iodine released from the site in a news story written by the investigative reporter. The information in the news story allowed the downwinder's doctors to finally diagnose and treat the baffling health problems she'd been plagued with for decades. As the years passed, the downwinder, the reporter, and the historian each continued to focus on the welfare of people injured by these radiation releases. Eventually, their paths crossed. They began to collaborate, working to reveal the true magnitude of the human toll of Hanford operations. The downwinder told both the reporter and the historian about the mysterious health problems she'd faced most of her life, and that she believed these health problems were caused by her child radiation exposure downwind of Hanford. The reporter and the historian listened to the downwinder's story and the stories of many others like her, delving into the truth of those stories and conveying that truth to the world through their research, reporting, and writing. I am that downwinder, and it's an honor for me today to appear with both the reporter and the historian of my story, two women who have done so much to create public awareness of the human toll of Hanford operations. First, Doran Steele, the award-winning investigative reporter who broke the stories of cancers and other disease downwind and downriver of Hanford, and Kate Brown, nuclear historian and award-winning author of, among other works, Plutopia, Nuclear Families, Atomic Cities, and the Great Soviet and American Plutonium Disasters. Now, I was heartbroken when I learned that I'd lived my infancy and childhood in Richland within clouds of invisible radiation released from Hanford. This radiation had saturated the air, the milk I drank, my food, and the waters of the Columbia River where I swam. And the death of my parents and brother following their own exposures to radiation released from Hanford only deepened my despair. The downwinder's stories have been dismissed, disregarded, and disbelieved by many of those who possess the power and authority to help us. We've faced overwhelming obstacles in our search for justice. Doran Steele and Kate Brown brought the downwinders hope. They listened, understanding that there was truth in our stories. In the face of risk to their careers and even death threats, they persevered, courageously bringing our stories to light in the face of powerful entities hoping to minimize or entirely negate the human toll of exposure to radioactive fallout from Hanford and other U.S. nuclear weapons production and testing activities. Steele and Brown are true heroes to the countless civilians who have been harmed by nuclear weapons production and testing on our own soil and within the Pacific Proving Grounds. Their voices, courage, and compassion have helped restore my faith in the goodness of humanity. May their words and voices and the voices of the downwinders help ensure that civilians are never again sacrificed by government intent upon domination through production, testing, and deployment of nuclear weapons. Thanks.
Thank you, Tricia, for that introduction. I'm really excited to have you all here to talk about, the different perspectives that brought you, to working on Hanford and kind of hearing how those stories interconnect. So maybe if we could just do kind of a round robin and talk about how each of you came to work on Hanford downwinder issues. And Trisha, we just heard a little bit from you. So maybe Kate, we can start with you and then go to Karen.
Sure. Well, I was trained as a Soviet historian, and I wrote a book that had to do that. The epilogue of the book ended up in the Chernobyl zone, and it was just I wasn't interested in nuclear history, but I got interested. An editor called me up and said, "Would you write a whole book about Chernobyl?" And I said, "No, definitely not. This is like 2000. There's too much about Chernobyl." But I noticed that there are two places in the world where the emissions of radioactive isotopes dwarfed Chernobyl 2 to 4 times over, and those were the places where the Soviets and the Americans produced plutonium during the Cold War. And I said, that's an interesting story. And what was interesting about it to me is that both of these two places, these plants, in very different societies, a communist, authoritarian society, the heartland of democracy and capitalism, both of them produce about the same amount of radioactive emissions, about an estimated 350 million curies. And I said, well, that's funny that, there's the same number. So I decided to tell these two stories together, thinking there's probably something to this connection, and indeed there was. And as I worked the story, at first I was just interested in the security arrangements. I thought that the people of Hanford and the Russian equivalent of Hanford, Ozyorsk, were sort of like the pioneers of the nuclear security state. They were the first ones who were willing to turn over their urine samples, to have their mail read, and have their conversations listened to over the phone, to be surveilled at work very closely, and in schools and recreation programs. And I thought, in many ways, they're our founding, the pioneers of our societies today, where we all sort of like happily collude sometimes in our own surveillance. But the more I worked this story, the more I met people like Trisha, who had these stories to tell about their health, that they associated with the plants. And I went and talked to the scientists, and the scientists said, oh, those people are radiophobic. They don't know what they're talking about. They're just, normal citizens, or they're dumb farmers or something like that. And so I just kept delving deeper and deeper into this story. And then I came across the work of people like Karen, Doran, Steele, who had been doing this investigative reporting in the 1980s at a time when it was really hard to get the story. So let me turn it over to you, Karen.
Yes, thanks. Yeah, I was hired by the Spokesman Review in 1982. I'd had a career in public television for 10 years. I'd had a weekly public affairs show in Spokane. And before that, I'd worked in Congress. I had degrees in history, a BA and an MA in history. I've always been very interested in history, and have worked quite a bit in my reporting career with historical documents. But when I went to the paper, this is the beginning of the Reagan administration, and the administration had announced a new nuclear arms buildup to counteract, as Ronald Reagan put it, the evil empire of the Soviet Union. And so this meant for Hanford, for Richland and the Tri-Cities in Washington State, a whole new mission. We knew quite a bit. There's been a lot written about World War II and the fact that the plutonium produced at Hanford was dropped on the city of Nagasaki, one of the bombs at least. But this was a new era, and it meant that old plants that hadn't run since the 1950s, such as the Purex plutonium plant, it sounded like a bleach plant, but it actually stands for plutonium uranium extraction, were reopening. And what did that mean? And one of the first calls I got about Hanford, which really struck me, was from a woman who said she worked at the Purex plant, and that they're having terrible problems there, and they might even blow up Pasco one of these days. She was very, very concerned. So of course I went to my editors and said, there's this woman on the phone. I have no idea if this is a true story or not. But I went down there, my editors let me go down there, and it turned out she was quite credible. She gave me a whole sort of a roadmap to how to cover this story, which documents I should look for. And at the time, there was missing plutonium from that plant, and the FBI was doing an investigation called a MUF investigation, kind of an odd acronym, materials unaccounted for. And that did happen. At first, Hanford officials really didn't want to talk about it. When I filed my Freedom of Information Act request, the FBI came to visit my editors in the newsroom, asking why suddenly a reporter in Spokane, Washington, a newspaper that had never really covered Hanford before, was interested in these subjects. And so I went ahead, wrote the story, and that really started a deluge of whistleblowers and other people commenting, calling me and contacting me, and it eventually led me to a farmer who lived right across the river from Hanford, named Tom Bailey, who invited me to come down and talk to his neighbors who had lived in this area since the 50s, which was the maximum time of plutonium production after World War II. And they wanted to talk to me about health problems in their neighborhood. And they are the closest farming community to Hanford, right across the Columbia River. And so I went and I heard farm family was keeping a death map, very concerned about early cancers and early other diseases in their community. Another talked to me about mysterious deaths of their sheep in the early 60s. One family had lost 100 sheep. And several hundred were lost in that particular farming community. The lambs were born mummified. Hanford people had come out and looked at them, but there was no follow-up. They didn't know what happened. And so all of this raised a whole lot of questions. And so it started me on a long search to find the documents that would corroborate these stories, perhaps, or not. We didn't know at the time whether this was a big story or not, and it turned out over the course of a couple of decades to be one of the largest nuclear disaster stories in the United States.
Maybe just really quick to kind of ground this. So Karen, you mentioned a few dates, but when did you kind of begin your work? And then Kate, when did you begin your research? And then Trisha, I know you've really lived this experience, but when did you kind of start maybe talking to folks and begin your work on your book, just so we can see kind of how each of your works built on each other and that connection there?
Well, I began my work in the early 1980s and followed it through in 1986 after many stories that I did and other reporters. The government was forced to release documents on Hanford's radiation history, contamination history. And they were amazing documents we can talk about later in this conversation, including a deliberate experiment that occurred in 1949 where Hanford deliberately released radiation into the inland Northwest as part of a military experiment. In 1990, the federal government admitted that they had caused harm at Hanford and said that they would go and study the people affected, the downwind civilians affected. And that led into litigation in the early 1990s. And so I covered Hanford in one way or the other from 1982 until 2015, when the Hanford downwinder litigation finally ended with, not with a bang, but a whimper, I guess you could say, with some very small settlements that were undisclosed and no major government apology or anything like that. But it was a dramatic story, and that's how long it took really to tell many of these stories.
Yeah, I started much later in 2006, and I worked, I guess about 6 years, and published Plutopia in 2013. And I was doing, both. I was working the Hanford story, and I was also working in Russia. And what was really valuable in both countries in the 1990s, at the end of the Cold War, is that there were tens of thousands of documents that had been classified in the course of the Cold War that were related to the making of nuclear weapons. And a lot of, not all, far from all, but many of these documents were declassified in the 1980s, with the time that Karen was talking about, thanks to activists who demanded in the United States. And then in 1992 in the Soviet Union, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the first Russian president released the archives in 1992. So we suddenly had all of these records, and the Department of Energy sort of flooded the internet, and Richland had a reading room. All of these former nuclear sites had reading rooms. You could really get a lot of information. What was interesting is that that flood of information reversed itself after 9/11 gradually. There was a big archive in Richland itself that the community had created. It was, sort of letters and diaries and documents that people in the community had donated to the Richland Museum. I worked at it in 2008, and I'm sorry, 2007, and I went back in the summer of 2008. So I'd like to see those documents again. And the archivist said, we don't have them. And I said, well, what happened? She said, the feds came and took them. They're vetting them for nuclear secrets. I said, well, when do you expect to have them back? And she said, we'll never get them back. So this was a story, in the 1990s when Karen was working, progressively got more and more access information, and access shut down around about 2006, and we get less and less information. So we happened to be working at a time when we could find out about this story, probably more than we may know for a long, long time.
It's very interesting about the archives in the Soviet Union. I was able to go with a group of Physicians for Social Responsibility group in the Pacific Northwest in 1992 to the region that you write about in Plutopia, Kate. I mean, we went to the large city of Chelyabinsk, which is near the Mayak, their plutonium production facility at Mayak, but we were not able to go to the town of Ozersk. That you mentioned, which was there, Richland. But we were able to talk to people from the region, farmers, peasants, people who lived along the very radioactive Chacha River. But there's never, to my knowledge, there's never been another radioecological conference in Chelyabinsk after 1992. You'd have to corroborate that, but I was only there once. But it seemed like it was a very brief window where this opened up for an international discussion, and then it just slammed shut.
Yeah.
Well, I think Tom Bailey, who you're talking about, was he along on that trip? Because I think he was on some trips, and there was some other collaboration in the 1990s. Mm-hmm. The interesting thing is that as Putin got more and more power, he cracked down on environmentalists, and so some of when I first started to go to the Chelyabinsk area in the, like 2007 and 8, there were a lot of activists who were working, but by 2015, they had all been pretty much chased out and accused of treason, accused of, spying for the Americans. And most of them now are abroad as exiled refugees. So that's a really sad story.
It is. Okay, let's see. Me, I was exposed to what's called low-dose ionizing radiation as a child, and after that, there's something called a latency period before you really feel the effects of your exposure. So I started getting ill when I was a teenager, around 18 or so, and so I was sick for a long time. And nobody knew what was wrong because the Department of Energy hadn't told anyone that we've been exposed to vast amounts of radioiodine and other radionuclides. And I lived in California. Many of the people who were in the Hanford area moved outside of the area, and so they're scattered all over the country. Because I was in California, it took a while longer for the news of the declassified documents in 1986 to reach me. It wasn't until 1988 when I was visiting my grandmother in Spokane that I read one of Karen's articles. And it talked about radioiodine releases in the 1940s, which was a great relief to me since I wasn't born until 1950. I had escaped everything, so I was so happy. But I felt really bad for all the people who'd been exposed, and later learned that there were decades more of radiation releases. But so it was Karen's work that alerted me to this whole situation, and I felt really terrible about that. And I remember how I met Kate, which is really interesting. It was through a person who's an epidemiologist named Steve Wing, University of North Carolina, a really amazing, wonderful person. I'm so sad he passed away. I really miss him. And he told me I needed to find out what Kate was doing, and he said to Kate that she needed to find out what I was doing. And that's the first contact I'd had with Kate. And you came to our house eventually and talked to my daughter, and it was great. So we've been overlapping, and I know Kate and Karen have consulted many times. So it's been all of us working on a topic in our own ways, but overlapping and sort of using each other's resources and support. So it's been wonderful. But that's kind of when I started being aware of the situation.
That's great. Well, one thing that really just stuck out to me while y'all were talking is something that Karen said after her, the first article you published, and kind of the sea of whistleblowers and stories that started coming in. And it's just really fascinating how once you can elevate, a voice, how much this story kind of starts unraveling and you can learn more. So I'd really like to talk to all three of you about, some people you've met, and downwinders in particular who you've spoken to, and any stories you'd like to share in that sense that have come out of your work and the books. And yeah.
Do you mind if I start on that? Well, is that okay with everyone? Thank you so much. One reason I wrote this book was that in 2015, as the final settlements were going out the door, and these were very meager settlements. We're talking a couple $1,000s to some people with cancer. I mean, really small settlements. I thought as soon as the settlements are out the door, people are going to forget about the Hanford downwinders. And one of the problems we've always had as downwinders, people will say, I don't really believe you. Where's the evidence that, that Hanford caused these issues you have? And I thought, what more credible group of people are there than the plaintiffs who've just received settlements, from the government? So I sent a letter out, thanks to the help of Tom Folds' firm in Spokane, Seattle, and Dick Iman's firm in Spokane. And people who responded to me, then I interviewed them. So these were all people who had received settlements, except for just a couple of them. And most of them were thyroid related, thyroid disease, thyroid cancer, autoimmune thyroiditis, for which there exist epidemiologic studies at other sites like the Marshall Islands, Nevada Test Site, Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island. So there were these epi studies the plaintiff's attorneys could use. So one reason I wanted this book out there now is to provide the evidence people always ask for. Where's the evidence? Here's the evidence. Here are 24 people with credible diseases, epidemiologically tied to radioiodine that was documented as released from Hanford. This is the strongest possible evidence that could be offered. There are a few people who had river cancers as well, and those were a little harder to prove, but there were a few people who got a small recovery from that. But I just wanted to say that the people who I interviewed, Simone had asked about the downwinders, most of them hadn't ever spoken publicly before. And a few of them had, but most of them said, I decided I wanted to do this, even though this would give, I was tempted to do it anonymously, but I decided to put my name out there. I've never done anything like this before, but this can't happen again. And I really want people to know my story because I've had so much loss, so much suffering. The government's never apologized. They've never helped us, and it's wrong. So that's what I heard over and over. So that's just my 2 cents worth.
Well, a few of the, as you say, Tricia, most of them had not spoken before. A few of them had. One of them was interesting how this happened. When I wrote the stories about the Green Run and the secret 1949 military experiment in which the Air Force flew planes over this vast radiation cloud that they had deliberately created. They were trying to do surveillance in the Hanford area, including over Spokane and our whole region of the inland Northwest, in order to calibrate their instruments for detecting plutonium production in the Soviet Union. But anyway, when I wrote those stories, of all the documents that were released in 1986, that was the most shocking one. Routine accidents, upsets, well, people could maybe understand those, even though they'd been kept secret, but a deliberate experiment that exposed people without their knowledge was really shocking to the readers in our region. But one of those people, the Associated Press, picked up my stories, and one of the downwinders was June Casey, who is in your book. She had been a freshman in Whitman College in 1949, in December 1949, when the Green Run occurred. And she got terribly ill, just immediately after the Green Run. Her hair started falling out in clumps, and she went home to her mother at Christmas time and her father, and they were shocked by her appearance. But of course, nobody knew that there was any possible link to radiation. And her parents ended up taking her to doctors for years and years, and nobody could figure it out. It wasn't until the story that I wrote in 1986 that she said, maybe this is it. This is why. And her hair never grew back. She still had a wig. She had all kinds of other health problems, and she continues to have health problems. So that's just one example of how this ripple effect of the public's knowledge, which they didn't have before, made many people put two and two together. And the stories are widespread in those farming communities around Hanford too, where I interviewed people. At first, regional officials poo-pooed the stories, and as Kate said people were radiophobic. But then it turned out that in the dose reconstruction, it turned out that Tom Bailey's neighborhood, the neighborhood of the farmer downwinders, received the largest estimated doses during the 50s of anybody in the region. So they were right on when they started worrying about their health consequences.
Yeah, I think that's what happens, is that people think this is their own individual trauma and they're unlucky in some way. And then someone like Karen starts writing stories, and then people begin to, like Trisha, begin to connect the dots. But then you still have officials who say, no, those people are just making stuff up. And they learn that there was some emissions from, maybe minor emissions, from the plutonium plants, and then any health problem they have, they associate with radiation. So the next step, I think, is to sort of link those community of people who are starting to come together over these stories and this realization that happened in the 80s, and link that with the evidence that comes out of the classified archives. And my method was to go back and forth, and somebody asks in the chat, did I learn Russian? I learned Russian when I was in college, and I studied in what was then the Soviet Union in 1987. So I was there a year after the Chernobyl accident. So I knew Russian when I first started going to Chelyabinsk. That wasn't an obstacle for me, but I needed to learn the language of physics and of medicine, which were entirely new languages for me at that time. But what I kept seeing going back and forth between the United States and the Soviet Union are these farmers telling me these same crazy stories. Tom Bailey, we've mentioned, is a farmer who lived in what they call the Death Mile, and he would tell me crazy stories, and I'd be like, why am I spending time with this guy? He's nuts. This is like late night radio, conspiracy theory after conspiracy theory. But then I would be working in the archive, and I'd be, sure enough, Tom was right. The stories were just so incredible that they belied credibility. You at first refused to believe them. But then they would check out in the archives. And then I would go to Russia, and people would tell me very similar stories about their health. The focus of lawsuits, as Tricia has pointed out, has been on cancers and acute symptoms such as cancers and death. That's all that ever gets counted in these radiation studies. But I think Tricia can tell you that there are all kinds of other things that happen when people are affected with chronic low doses of radiation. Their organs have radioactive isotopes deposited in them. Those radioactive isotopes emanate a powerful energy from inside the body, and the digestive tract doesn't work so well anymore, and then the respiratory tract doesn't work so well anymore. The heart starts to malfunction. The endocrine system kind of blows up and misrules the body. The gut microbiome starts to get sort of disorderly microbes. And so people start to just feel unwell, like the June Casey that Karen was talking about, and they don't know why. And it's not something that's easily identifiable, like, there's lead in the water and there's lead in the body that you can then detect, and you know what lead poisoning is. It's far more individual. Doses are quite individual, and so are people's reaction to them. So these are one of the most difficult kinds of cases to prove. But what we do know is that lots of people got sick and lots of people were exposed. And the scientists in both the Soviet Union and the United States were full of denials about these facts.
Mm-hmm. I was really fascinated in Plutopia, your book, about how you conflated Richland and Oziosk, these plutonium sites, and they had many things similar about them. But what was different is that the Soviets actually studied the people living near the sites. Hanford never did. They said, when I asked them, well, what about this, after I wrote the death mile stories, they said, well, we've never studied them because we wouldn't expect to see anything. Well, John Goffman, a nuclear physicist at Berkeley, said, well, you certainly wouldn't expect to see anything if you never studied them. So, but it was such a striking contrast to me how the two countries dealt with their civilian populations.
Why do you think it was so different? Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but
yeah, I was going to answer that question.
Yeah, thank you.
One official I spoke to here, because Trish and I went to the National Cancer Institute. We talked to the acting director during the Cold War. And we said, why did you never do any studies on the connection between radiation and cancer at the National Cancer Institute? And he said, yeah, we knew, of course, that there was a connection, but no scientists wanted to do that. That would mean they would go political.
Yeah.
So even to ask that question, does radiation cause cancer, was a political question. It wasn't an open-ended scientific question. So in the Soviet Union, they weren't worried about leaks. They weren't worried about information getting outside of these highly controlled places where they're doing this research. And so that, unfortunately, is one of the uses of a closed society, is you can ask open-ended scientific questions and seek answers and not worry about what the liabilities that come afterwards. So in the United States, we find that the people in charge, the scientific administrators and the scientists themselves, actually shut down the pursuit of knowledge, squelched it.
And it's hard being a person I'm used to being logical. I was an attorney and an occupational therapist before I learned about Hanford, and I'm, excuse me, I'm used to being logical. And suddenly I'm being treated like a person that doesn't know what I'm talking about when I'm talking about downwinders. Where did all my credibility suddenly go? This one topic, I'm not credible. I'm credible everywhere else, but not when I talk about downwind health issues. Like, what? So it's sort of like what Kate was saying, they just don't believe people, and they don't study us either. And if they studied us, they'd have more information about these health issues. And they'd be able to say, that's probably not caused by radiation. That is, this isn't, but they don't study us. So anyway.
Another strange thing is that there were a lot of studies in our country by the Atomic Energy Commission, the radiation establishment, but they were done in secret, most of them, and so the public didn't even know about them. Like the Transuranium Registry for a long time, where they were secretly taking tissue samples of dead nuclear workers, and we only got glimpses into this at Hanford when something went wrong. I think the most dramatic story that I uncovered was that of a Swedish plant worker, Carl Johnson, big strapping guy, in 1952, who died suddenly at work in one of these plants. And they took him home, and the officials told her he died of he lived for a few hours and he died. And then the officials said, well, he died of a heart attack, but his widow, Marie Johnson, found burns on his body. And all I had was, paper documents about this incident. But I tracked down Marie Johnson in Chicago, and she was still alive. And she was in her 90s living with her son, and she was still just hopping mad about this, even though she never had talked about it before publicly. She said they followed her all around Hanford. They threatened her, but what she decided to do was take her husband's body to Chicago for a second autopsy. And the second autopsy doctor said he likely died of radiation related an accident, because of the burns on his body and other things that he looked at. But General Electric, who was running Hanford at the time, was so concerned that they flew a plane from Richland to Chicago to try to talk the second autopsy doctor out of his opinion. They did not want this as a precedent, apparently. And so that led me into a whole other area of labor and industry, and how if there were accidents at Hanford, how the state recorded them in their records. And it turned out that Hanford had almost complete control over what went to the state, with no independent oversight by the state of any of these facilities at Hanford. So that's an example of how closed this system was. They were getting information, but they weren't using it for the general good. They were using it to keep the consequences of radioactive accidents from the public.
So it sounds like there was a real, suppression of people's stories and what people were living through, and kind of the radiation problems and all of that. And then all of you kind of mentioned this, people were afraid to come forward with their stories. Is it because of this active kind of suppression of people's voice?
Speaking about these things as a member of the Richland community was a very brave act. And other people who worked, everybody's livelihood came from the plant. And so when people spoke up, and Karen has covered some of these stories, and I wrote about some of these stories, they were attacked by their neighbors. Their family members were, the phone would ring and there'd be a death threat. There were actual attempts to kill people who were whistleblowers from within the community. So most of the people who came forward were people who lived outside of the community, in the farming area around there.
Yeah.
It sounds like there's a question here for Karen from Dan Greenhouse, but I don't know what the question is. And then there's a question for me. The difference between the two landscapes, they're really different rivers. The Columbia is a mountainous river with a rocky bottom. It's got a high volume. The Russian River, where they dumped 3.2 million curies of radioactive waste into it from 1949 to 1951, because they ran out of underground waste storage tanks for the most ragingly hot radioactive waste. That river, the Chacha River, is slow, turgid, muddy, bogs down into lakes and streams. And 28,000 people lived along it and drew from the river. They didn't have wells. They used the river to drink and to fish, to swim, to bathe, to cook, water their livestock, and to irrigate their crops. So that Chacha River disaster was probably one of the earliest nuclear accidents of that dimension.
When I was in Chelyabinsk, we were going up to that area along the Chacha in 1992 in a bus to talk to some villagers. And in the bus with us was Tom Cochran, who is a physicist from the Natural Resources Defense Council. And when our bus crossed the Chacha on a little bridge, he had a Geiger counter with him, and it just spiked, just bam, we could hear it in the bus. It just went all, it maxed out just by, driving over the river. I mean, this is 1992. It's just an amazing thing that I'll never forget.
Right. I want to back up to real quickly to something where we were talking about Richland culture. There was an unusual event that happened. I believe it was 1999 when David Michaels was going from production site to production site, collecting evidence to support a Nuclear Workers' Compensation Act. And there was a huge, very long session where workers came together in the federal building, downtown Richland, and family members as well, to testify about injuries and illnesses they had. And I went because I wanted to testify on behalf of both my parents, who were both nuclear workers, who both died of cancers. And it went on for 4 hours, and it's the very only time I've ever seen people, especially call them old timers in Richland, talk freely about their injuries and illness. And after that meeting, it kind of went away again. Nobody talks about it anymore. It was like this one episode, which was historic and amazing, and now it's not there anymore. But it was sort of surreal in that way. But it gathered enough testimony that eventually they passed this EEOICPA Nuclear Workers' Compensation Act, and they went to all the different sites. But I just wanted to mention that because it was so bizarrely, such a contrast to the norm there in Richland.
So we have another question from someone who asks, are there similar health risks if there's an accident in our reactors and waste storage at Hanford today, and how severe of health risks? Before I turn it over to y'all, I'll just do a little input. We recently just did a webinar about the risks at the waste encapsulation and store facility, the WESA facility, if that were to fail because it's aging infrastructure. And that is the place to store the over 1,000 strontium and cesium capsules. And that if that building were to fail, as aging infrastructure does, we would see, you know, a Chernobyl-like accident there at Hanford, just given the amount of radiation and toxic pollution that's stored there. So that would be my first answer. I will turn it over, though, to y'all for your opinion on that.
Well, Hanford, you're right. Hanford waste disposal is a really kind of a dicey subject. In the early days, they didn't really, in the early days, in the 40s and in the 50s, waste was a really secondary consideration. And so all kinds of awful things happened. They cascaded high-level nuclear waste into the ground, and then they had to dig up trenches because some of the really most active radionuclides got too close to each other, and they did fear that there'd be some kind of a criticality incident or explosion. The tanks weren't chronicled well. I mean, they weren't what's in them was not denoted well at all. And of course, in more recent years, there have been several incidents of plutonium exposures and exposures to other radionuclides to Hanford workers. So it's by no means safe, a safe place to be. They have made some progress. They've gotten the chromium plumes that were flowing into the Columbia River cleaned up. Lots of these old plutonium processing facilities have been decommissioned, but in the waste farms and the waste tanks, there's still some real safety issues.
You know, one thing came out in a 2016 report, noticed that the 3 counties around the Hanford plant, Franklin, Benton, and somebody help me, what's the other county?
Adams, is that right?
I think so. Have the highest rates of a certain birth defect, a neurotube disorder called anencephaly. Anencephaly is when Tom first told me about it, the famous farmer Tom Bailey, he said, you know, we have babies born here without heads. And I thought, oh my God, this guy's crazy. But sure enough, that's a really common birth defect among fetuses exposed in the womb to radioactive exposures. And so that's, I think, 6 times higher than anywhere else in the world in these 3 counties around the plant. Now, the Washington State epidemiologist, we contacted her and we said, what's going on? And they did a report. The report took them about a year, and they said, well, we looked at everything, and we were told that radiation doesn't leave the Hanford nuclear reservation, which is we know that's not true. We know a cyclone fence.
You've been there, it's so windy. Like, if you've been there, it's so windy. Like, that response, it's just crazy to me. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but
yeah. So they said, we don't know what's causing this big bump in anencephalic babies.
There was also, Tricia can speak to this because her infant brother died, but from the late 40s through the early 50s, there was a huge excess infant death rate in the Tri-Cities, and there was even one in Spokane. There's a graveyard in Spokane with 600 graves, and 230 of them are infants. And nobody has been able to run that to ground, what happened, but it really does raise questions about, because that was Hanford's, prime plutonium production era from the late 40s through the late 50s. And there was a lot of radiation in the air.
Yeah, and it was at that time, sorry, Tricia, go ahead.
No, go ahead, sorry. Go ahead.
Well, it was at that time that the doctors in Richland were, like mid-50s, were saying, just by the by, 25% of the kids in the Richland schools have birth defects. 25%.
Amazing. Yeah, you know, because I was looking for my brother's grave, it's a long story. My parents weren't very honest about this. So I had an older brother who died in 1947 in Richland. I looked, and there's a historic cemetery in Richland that has 300 almost identical baby graves, just all next to each other. And then Pasco has, as Karen mentioned, a couple hundred, and Walla Walla's got all kinds. There's a lot of baby graves there from the same periods of time, but nobody's really looked into that or found the, researched the death certificates to see at least what was listed as the reason for death. So it's a big issue, needs research.
Yeah.
So go ahead, Karen. Go ahead.
I'm in, unless you want to go on to some other topic, the Chernobyl, rather Richland versus Oziosk. I'm wondering what kind, if any, pushback you got in Richland. You're essentially comparing the Soviet production site to our Richland production site in terms of their cultures, privileged people they thought they were in a safe zone, but their work was contaminating this vast region. What do people in Richland think about your conclusions on that?
They're not happy. They have not been happy in the past. And there was, what was that, Tricia, the 30th anniversary of plutonium production?
I'm not sure. You mean when we did the speech where the fire alarm went off during your part of it?
The entire time. Fancy that.
Yeah, only during your presentation.
Yeah, and but that was an incredible story. So they were going to celebrate the 30th anniversary of making plutonium, and it was going to be a true celebration. They were going to have play, casino night with plutonium poker chips, and they were going to, light off a mock bomb, and they brought in a number of scholars, but they brought in a big bomb scholar, and people to talk, historians to talk about American know-how and how Americans won the war with this bomb. And Tricia got in touch with them and said, well, why don't you invite Kate Brown? She's written a whole book about the Hanford plant. And Tricia didn't get a response, and she kept sending emails and didn't get calling, no response. She finally had to go to social media, and then they finally answered her emails and said, well, we need $2,500 for Kate Brown to add her to the docket. And Tricia's like, where are we going to get that money? So I said, well, let me call them. And I called them and I said, listen, I have frequent flyer miles. I'll fly myself out. I can stay with friends there, and I'll give a talk without any need for an honorarium. And I'm sure we can even raise money for a hall. So how much would it cost to put this, in your program? And they said $2,500. So they raised money. The downwinders raised money, like $11, in cash and checks, like in envelopes. And they raised this money. We got them down to $1,500, I think.
Yep.
And so they were supposed to provide a hall and do publicity. And so we got there. And Tricia and I were looking for the hall, and it's some back, off the big bomb historian was at the main downtown with the big, marquee says Hanford historian. He doesn't write really about Hanford, but and then but we were out, on the outskirts of town. It was very hard to find the hall, and because there were no posters or anything, and the organizers were there. I said, did you print the flyers you were supposed to print? And she goes, yeah, we printed them. I said, did you post them? And she goes, oh, well, maybe we forgot to do that.
That's right. There was a pile of them right inside the door.
Yeah. And so then there was a long introduction. The introduction was fine. And then I started to speak. And then this beeping noise started to go up. It's like the beeping noise when a truck backs up. And it'd go on for 30 seconds and it'd go off for 60 seconds and then on the whole time. So the TV cameras, the local TV and radio were there. They just got up and left. How are you going to, do anything with that? And then when there was a panel of downwinders, they let the sick people speak without the beeping noise. But again, you can't say anything. They said, well, that must have been an Amber Alert,
Right,
something.
they did. Yeah, that was that.
But if you say, I think you did that on purpose, then you're a conspiracy theorist. Mm-hmm. And then some people came up to me afterwards and they said, you called us racist and uncaring, and that, wasn't very nice of you. I didn't specifically. I mean, you know, it was a racist time in American history. Unfortunately, we're still in a racist time in American history. And so I didn't mean to single out. I mean, I think the people in Richmond had really tough choices as working class people, having to do the dirty work, while, you know, managers and supervisors and the professional class people could sit back.
And this is ongoing, this issue of what is Hanford's legacy. I mean, there have been several books written about, as you say, the know-how, the wonderful project and everything like that. But there's almost, I went on the B Reactor tour now, you know, recently, since it's now a National Park Service site. And there's a lot about the wonderful gizmo and ending the war, but nothing on radiation consequences, nothing on the Cold War and the aftermath to what was produced at Hanford. And I know both of you, or at least Tricia, you're working on this, but I'd love to hear both of your perspectives on that. What should citizens be doing to ensure that the entire story of Hanford is told?
Yeah, but real quickly, we have a group called CORE, Consequences of Radiation Exposure. It's a nonprofit in Washington State. We're asked by the National Park Service, who co-manages each of the 3 sites of the Manhattan Project Historic National Park, one of which is Hanford, to give recommendations to them of what the exhibit should be and what the descent should be composed of. And so we did. And one of our recommendations was that all stories of both Hibakusha and must be included if you want to tell the full picture of what happened, of the legacy of Hanford. And the problem we have is the National Park Service and the Department of Energy are supposed to work together on this this park, but the Department of Energy has so much power and the National Park Service has so little that I don't have a whole lot of hope that our recommendations are going to be able to be enacted by the National Park Service, even if they want to do so. So we really do need public support and help to get these stories told.
Yeah, I was part of the National Park Service expert committee when they first opened these new 3 sites that were Manhattan Project sites. And there's a committee of Japanese who came, who paid their way and asked to attend this meeting. They made the same point, and I made the same point, that it's not all good news that people were harmed by these weapons, even with friendly fire, let alone the people who were harmed in Japan. And they said, yeah, we're going to tell that story. But as Karen, you know, points out, the reactor tour, you just hear what a great project it was and how unbelievably, I think, the project saved the last, you know, free flowing run of the Columbia River, and the last, you know, this is the only site of native sage and native grasses. You know, that's just greenwashing, basically a military site.
So we have about 7 minutes left, and we've gotten a lot of questions in the chat. But maybe first I wanted to ask if there's any kind of last stories or anything that you want to share. And if not, I can definitely ask some of these questions as well. So up to the panelists.
Well, just one comment I have is that you have large numbers of people who are exposed to Hanford's radiation. They were tracked successfully within the Hanford thyroid disease study. Those people can be tracked, and they should be studied for some of the other health effects that were caused by their exposure to low-dose ionizing radiation. It's been proven that you can track a large percentage of these people. And so there we have this large group of people willing to be studied. They're not being studied. There's no excuse for that, because the more studies we have, the more health issues will be either identifiable as caused by low-dose ionizing radiation or not caused by low-dose ionizing radiation. So we need more answers, and there's a nice available pool of people. That's all I want to say.
We know a lot about high doses of radiation from the Hiroshima studies in Nagasaki. We don't know anything about low doses. Go ahead, Karen.
One of the things I was struck with at the end of your book, Kate, was that you were saying that really in the last chapter, you said we're all citizens of Plutopia. And I know that's something you stressed in your second book on Chernobyl. I mean, how much of the rest of Russia and also Eastern Europe was affected. And maybe that's the story that really needs to be told, is it's not just sites producing weapons material or having accidents or bomb tests, but all of these endeavors together, the arms race, has really meant that we're all living in Plutopia. Is that what you meant by
saturated? Yes, absolutely. Saturated the Northern Hemisphere. And just Google the dose reconstruction map for the Nevada test site. I mean, the Americans were the only country in the world. Most countries blew up bombs in other people's, their colonial territories on the peripheries, but the Americans blew up bombs in Nevada, in the heartland, and that bomb fallout went sky high, and then it blew with the trade winds north and east and came down with precipitation. So what you actually, a lot of these studies for the Nevada test site are done right in Utah and Nevada, right around the ground zero. But what you find if you look at those maps is that the really hot spots were where the precipitation came down first. North Dakota, northern Minnesota is like hotter than ground zero. And so we haven't even begun to broach that. But if you start to look, and this was happening, Nevada test site was just one of places that were blowing up big bombs, hydrogen bombs during the Cold War. But if what you look at the statistics in the Northern Hemisphere, where most of this fallout came down, what you see are some troubling numbers of a climbing cancer rate. So cancer used to be rare, it's supposed to be really rare among children. That really flips around 1952. The cancer rate for people born after 1952 continues to climb. Rates of birth defects have been on the rise. Male sperm counts have dropped in half since 1945. So these are just correlations, but we don't know about causation. But I think we should get a lot more curious, because we're, as I say, we all are in this together. A health physicist would tell you, oh, everybody's got plutonium in their body, and we're supposed to be okay with that.
I have a question here in our last few minutes that I think is just a really natural follow-up to that. And it's this. So what do you think the American kind of public policy and what can we do to make government responses to nuclear accidents, and I would say just nuclear anything, less secretive?
I think the main thing is to have oversight. You can't allow weapons facilities to operate without independent oversight. I mean, one of my best sources at Hanford turned out to be the first ever Nuclear Regulatory Commission overseer who ever came to Hanford. They didn't want him there. They put him in a windowless broom closet in the federal building in Richland as his office. They gave him hell the whole time he was there, and he found some very important things that actually led to disqualifying Hanford as a site for the nation's repository of spent fuel rods, because he found out that iodine-129 was already in the aquifers around Hanford, and the qualifying condition for that repository was that you had to keep radiation from the Columbia River for 1,000 years. So independent oversight is probably the most important thing.
Absolutely. And I think there's a fantastic organization called Hanford Challenge. It's a nonprofit, and they raise money and they just watch the cleanup. And they've been on this job for the last 25 years. And this is, I think we need to have not just one big nuclear regulatory agency, which is, very easily politicized, but local stakeholder agencies that get, federal subsidies to form committees of scientists and citizen scientists and concerned citizens who watch these areas wherever they are, whether it's a civilian power plant or a nuclear weapons facility or a chemical plant, to make sure that what the companies and the contractors are saying is really true. That we should have these kind of watchdog agencies. They should be built into all of these polluting industries.
And I think it's helpful
and they should be made of people who live there who care. Pardon me, go ahead, sorry.
Well, I think it's important too to have public members, even though public members aren't always our articulate, they often have something really important to say if you listen to them. I mean, we may sound anecdotal all the time, but if you listen and have a couple of actual just community people, especially ones who've been impacted by some of the releases from the site, it adds a lot to the advisory group or oversight group.
And
Local
that's
people know
go ahead.
which way the river runs. They know what the soils are like. They know how wind blows. They know different seasons. People, scientists zoom in or watch, regulators who zoom in for 2 weeks and then go away again, don't have family members in the community, don't know who's getting sick, who's had a miscarriage, who's had a child die. Those people don't know enough as the local people do. Sorry, Simone.
No, it's absolutely true. And that's definitely this kind of watchdog oversight, why Columbia Riverkeeper was founded originally and what we continue to do in our Hanford work, working with, awesome organizations like Hanford Challenge, Heart of America Northwest, Physicians for Social Responsibility. And it's really, as terrible as it is, it's really up to the public to hold the government accountable so we can know what's happening and what's affecting us and everything. But I think our time is up. So with that, I know that there is so much more to cover with you all, and I would just want to express my immense gratitude for all of your phenomenal work and really paving the way to bring these stories to light and sharing these stories and amplifying these voices and all of that. So Karen, Tricia, Kate, thank you for your work, your novels, and your reporting, and thank you for joining us tonight. Really appreciate it.